Robert Koopman, you gave just a lecture here at the Institute on trade and the future of trade. Now, you're an American and also the chief economist of the World Trade Organization. What about Donald Trump? You just once said today that you think he's somehow stuck in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm. What I said was the policies look like, to me, that the U.S. administration feels like they might have a lot of market power in the global economy around trade. And whether they do or not is, I think, something that we have to watch for to see how they navigate around their current rhetoric around wanting to impose tariffs on other member countries. And if other member countries provide the U.S. with significant concessions as a result of that, then maybe they're right. If they're unsuccessful at getting concessions, then perhaps the world has changed.
One of these examples that he seems to be thinking of, that, oh, I look out of my window in Washington and I see a lot of Mercedeses and I don't see any Chevrolets when I look out of my window in Berlin. But that implies saying buy Chevrolets. But you know, General Motors changed in 2005 their model policy in Europe, and most Chevrolets here in Europe are Korean now. They're Daewoo's imports. So what he says actually is buy Korean. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think the things like global value chains and global integration over the last 35 years has made it very difficult to say, is a car made in the United States, is a car made in Germany? I mean, lots of German cars have content from Eastern Europe, right, and other parts of Europe. I believe that the largest manufacturer that exports from the United States is BMW. So I think it's very difficult to tell where a car is produced from, and I think those kinds of rules of thumb are not as useful in this modern economy as maybe they were 50 years ago.
You also said that trade policies don't play such an important role in trade growth. You estimate that only at 25%. How comes that?
Well, because a lot of trade is related to fundamental macroeconomic conditions, like, as I said, investment and consumer demand. It's, that 25% is not something to ignore, and that's something that policymakers can very much act on directly through negotiating their tariff commitments, whereas the rest of it is left up to, business sentiment and consumer sentiment. But those sentiments are very important drivers of trade growth.
You also said that the past 35 years were different to those 35 years before that, and the next 35 years will be even more different. What's it going to be, the future?
Well, I think the future is it's going to be different, right? Technology is changing rapidly. Digitally enabled technology is changing how manufacturing is done. Consumer preferences change and adjust to these new technologies. So I think the future of trade is going to depend a lot on whether or not production is more localized or more concentrated. There's a lot of uncertainty there. I think there's a lot of work for economists and sociologists to try to figure out where future trade is going.
You also said that trade is maybe growing at only at 1.5% percentage point fast, no, 1.5 times faster than GDP, and no more 2 to 3 times as it was like in the past 20 years or something.
Right. So I think what we saw in the long 1990s was the opening up of the European socialist countries, and India then opened up, and China with a dramatic opening up from very centrally planned. Those were large populations, generally well educated. So huge parts of the labor force suddenly expanded with the introduction of these countries, and then they started to integrate in trade, whereas before they had been very isolated. That caused trade to grow very fast, foreign direct investment to grow very fast, and I just don't see other places where you're going to see that kind of adjustment of that many people, that large of economy.
You also talked about 3D printing, which might it totally superfluous to export any goods anymore across countries.
Well, I do think there will always be some manufacturing trade, but things like 3D printing allow people to it could be more efficient, as additive manufacturing tends to use less resources than subtractive manufacturing. And it allows people to buy things from all over the world, potentially customize them to their very specific needs, and produce it locally.
And then you also said China is going to be a net importing country, probably according to your models.
What I said, it was not exactly that. What I said was, under those circumstances that we assumed, and some of those assumptions were rather extreme, that China, because of its change and its plans for changing the composition of its economy to 2035, that it could change dramatically its interface with the rest of the world, and it may not be a big net exporter. It could, under certain circumstances, become a big net importer.
Now, if all these things for trade go so badly, does anybody need the WTO in 35 years' time?
Well, I think the value of the WTO comes from the certainty that it gives to businesses and consumers around the costs that are going to be involved with moving goods across borders. That's not going to change. You need that certainty. A lot of economic research shows that if that uncertainty increases, trade drops, consumers lose, prices go up. So I think the fundamental reason for the WTO's existence will continue into the future. The question, I think, the more interesting question is, as the economy changes and becomes more digital, will the rules follow it? As services become more tradable across border, will members decide that they want to update those rules and extend those rules to those areas?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.